Good day and welcome to this special congressional briefing. What can Congress do? Faith leaders urge support for Palestinian Christians and Families Act, H.R. 2590. My name is Peter Makari, and I serve as executive for the Middle East and Europe in global ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and United Church of Christ. I also serve as co-convener of the Faith Forum for Middle East Policy, and I'm a board member and executive committee member of Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP. CMEP and the Faith Forum are pleased to sponsor this briefing today. And a special word of thanks to Kyle Christofalo, Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations at CMEP, and Jennifer Bing, Palestine Program at the American Friends Service Committee and the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. This virtual briefing is scheduled to last 1 hour and will be recorded, as there are some congressional offices that expressed interest but are not available today. We hope to have time to take a few questions, so please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to address them depending on time. Today, we are grateful for the opportunity to hear from Representative Betty McCollum and from several Christian leaders about H.R. 2590, the Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act. As the convergence of Passover, Holy Week, and Easter and Ramadan have led to increased tensions in Jerusalem and Israel-Palestine, we continue to be reminded of the urgency of addressing the core issues. Until those can be resolved, though, it is essential that the rights and dignity of the people there are upheld and respected, and that the U.S. plays a constructive role in holding accountable those who would deny those rights. This bill, introduced 1 year ago, goes further than each of the two previous bills Representative McCollum has courageously introduced to ensure that U.S. taxpayer funds are used responsibly. U.S. churches and Christian agencies form a wide base of support for this effort and are here today to express our backing of it. CMEP and the Faith Forum are deeply engaged in this effort. Formed in 1984, Churches for Middle East Peace, CMEP is a coalition of more than 30 national church communions and organizations, including Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and evangelical traditions, that works to encourage U.S. policies that actively promote a comprehensive resolution to conflicts in the Middle East with a focus on Israel-Palestine. CMEP works to mobilize U.S. Christians to embrace a holistic perspective and to be advocates of equality, human rights, security, and justice for Israelis, Palestinians, and all people of the Middle East. The Faith Forum for Middle East Policy is a network of US-based Christian denominations, agencies, and organizations that seeks to influence US government policy in support of a just peace in the Middle East. The Faith Forum is focused primarily on Israel-Palestine, but also works on issues in the broader region. The Faith Forum represents a diversity of perspectives and provides a setting where participants can identify common ground and strategies for collective action. Many of the members of CMEP and the Faith Forum have corresponding churches in the Middle East, are in partnership with churches and agencies there, or implement programs there. So all bring direct perspectives and connections to the people of the Middle East, Christians and people of other faiths, that inform our own understandings of the realities of Israeli occupation and Palestinian dispossession that the people there live on a daily basis. We are delighted that some of our members are represented here today, and we'll hear from a few of them, following remarks from Representative McCollum in this order. The Reverend Alex Awad is a retired United Methodist missionary. Reverend Awad served as pastor of the East Jerusalem Baptist Church, Dean of Students at the Bethlehem Bible College, and Director of the Shepherd Society. The Reverend Riz Prakasim is pastor of New Life Presbyterian Church in Roseville, Minnesota. The Reverend Regina Hassanally is bishop of the Southeastern Minnesota Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Susan Gunn is the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns and serves as chair of the board of Churches for Middle East Peace. And the Reverend Doug Mitchell, pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis, will offer our closing benedictions. Each will speak from their own experience and engagement, but not necessarily on behalf of the church denominations or agencies with which they are affiliated. Now it is a privilege for me to introduce Representative Betty McCollum. Representative McCollum is a Democrat representing the families of Minnesota's 4th District in the United States House of Representatives. In 2000, Congresswoman McCollum made history as only the second Minnesota woman elected to serve in Congress since statehood in 1858. Representative McCollum represents the residents of Minnesota's capital city, St. Paul, as well as all of Ramsey County and most of Washington County. In the 117th Congress, Congresswoman McCollum brings a common sense Minnesota perspective to her work as a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee, where she serves as chair of the Defense Subcommittee, vice chair of the Interior Environmental Subcommittee, and as a member of the Agriculture and Rural Development Subcommittee. Representative McCollum is also a member of the House Natural Resources Committee, where she joins her authorizing colleagues to tackle the urgent challenges of climate change, protecting public lands, and strengthening tribal sovereignty. H.R. 2590 is the third such bill she has introduced on Palestinian rights. Representative McCollum, would you please share with us about this act and say a few words about the Palestinian Children and Families Act and on the current situation as you observe it, why you introduced it, what does the bill ask, and what have you witnessed in terms of support? Representative McCollum.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you all for the work that you do. We're starting to take in-person meetings, but Zooms are still going to be important and part of our regular life because they allow us to interact when we're far apart. So I'm going to be looking all around the screen because I'm going to be looking at all of you as you appear in your boxes when I'm speaking. So thank you for including me today. So why did I introduce H.R. 2590 last April? Millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and the East Bank of Jerusalem, they are subject to repressive conditions under military occupation, and that's symptomatically has been violating the human rights. And the U.S. military aid to Israel enables that occupation. It does. Let's be clear about it. So I wanted to make sure there was some accountability into how that aid was used. So I think I go to the lowest common denominator on this to have discussions with people. Military detention in Israeli occupation areas, taking children as young as 12 years old out of homes and sometimes out of schools. I believe it is antithetical to the goals of peace, self-determination, security, equality, and justice. And what that does instead is it fuels instability, injustice, and an intergenerational cycle of violence. And that does not help project peace for the future in that region. So my strong belief is not $1 of military aid from the United States government to Israel should go towards supporting or enabling human rights abuses. So I believe my bill protecting children, their homes, the places in which they go to school, is a minimum of what the United States should be doing to send a strong message to Israel that human rights abuses against the Palestinian people are going to be condemned and they're not going to be tolerated. So in a nutshell, what this act does, and it's called the Defending Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation. The highlights that it does, it prohibits U.S. funding from being used for military detention or ill treatment of Palestinian children in Israel military detention centers. It prohibits supporting the seizure and destruction of Palestinian property and homes, and that's in violation of the international humanitarian law. And it would prohibit any support or assistance for Israel's unilaterally annexation of Palestinian territory, and that also is in violation of humanitarian law. So there has to be checks and balances in every bill. And so this bill would require the Secretary of State to certify annually to Congress that foreign aid to Israel does not violate any of the outline uses. And the Government Accountability Office would also have to submit an annual report to Congress. So there's a check to it. That's the bill in a nutshell. And I'm happy to talk about what's happening currently in Congress and some of the things that I think we can work on together. And this bill would not have been written had it not been for Israeli human rights groups and churches and synagogues and mosques and other people of great faith here in the United States. And so it is a work that we do together here at home and with Palestinians and also with Israelis.
Thank you, Representative McCollum. We're honored by your presence today and inspired by your ongoing work in this area. I wonder if you could share something about what you have seen in Congress among your colleagues and also from organizations in terms of support for this piece, this HR 2590 Act.
So before there was HR 2590, there was a bill going through the authorizing committee in state in foreign affairs, and it was starting to prohibit the use of medicine to be delivered even to children living in Israeli occupied areas, Palestinian children. And I started saying that was a human rights abuse. And we had churches and hospitals in the Twin City area that were actually supplying these life-sustaining, life-giving sometimes treatments for young children. So as I learned more from organizations such as yours and working with other human rights organizations around the world, we put forward the bill. So I just want to take a second because sometimes we're so focused on what isn't going right, we forget to take those moments to celebrate. So I want to celebrate all of you, the civil society advocates, the faith-based advocates and organizations for standing up for civil and human rights. And that's why this bill now has 32 co-sponsors. Now that's more than we've ever had before. It's still not enough to get a hearing in the House, but what we're starting to show is there's the core group of courageous people here in Congress who are willing to stand up for human rights, Palestinian rights, because they recognize that Palestinians deserve to be treated with dignity and with equality. But the majority of Congress still finds it very easy to demonize Palestinians and support Israel's unfairly having policies that systematically persecute Palestinians. Now, there's also a group now emerging that's becoming a little uncomfortable as they're learning more about some of the steps that the Israeli government is taking with the incarceration of these children, with the demolition of homes, and what also is currently going on with a two-tier system of citizenship between Israelis and Arab Israelis in Israel itself. And so there's a group of people that are becoming very uncomfortable with Israel's actions here, but they're not quite willing to change the status quo yet. And that's where your work becomes so important. So my bill is to, I'm a social studies teacher. So my bill is to bring forward a case study of what should you do as a member of Congress when faced with what is clearly a human rights violation, especially with children. So we're changing the narrative, and that's why our support continues to grow. And it's okay if people are uncomfortable where they are. That means they're thinking about where they should be.
Thank you very much. It sounds as if you have hope that there can be more co-sponsors in the remaining time in this 117th Congress.
I just ran into a member of Congress today. He was taping something and then taking a picture. It's a beautiful day here, sun shining. It's not 27 degrees here in Washington, D.C. And he was getting a picture taken with his intern, and I was having a picture taken with my intern at the Capitol. And he brought up my bill. And he said, well, I'm not there yet. He said, but I'm getting a lot of heat for not being on it. I'm getting a lot of criticism. And And I would just say, I know that this is the Minnesota way of kind of doing things, but, you know, to quote many of our grandmothers, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So when we have the conversations with people about this, we need to do it in a non-threatening, non-lecturing way, but in a way that opens up their hearts and minds and leaves them uncomfortable at the end of the conversation, thinking about it in the future. So the change is not going to happen overnight or over one bill, but I have to tell you, from that first conversation I had about making sure that life-saving drugs and cancer treatment would get into Palestinian children and standing up for that, we've come a long way here in Congress. We've come a long way in our society, and I wake up every day eternally optimistic that the good spirit in all of us has a chance to blossom and grow. And this bill is just one way in which I think we can reach out to members of Congress to do that.
Thank you. You've alluded a few times to the reality on the ground, and I'm just wondering if there's anything you'd like to add to conclude this part of the hearing on what you're hearing from your contacts on the current situation.
So I would close with 3 brief comments. The violence that we all just recently witnessed during Ramadan, Passover, and Easter in East Jerusalem. You know, these are some of the holiest times in all 3 books. And the angel Gabriel must have been weeping to see God's children treating each other this way. And I condemn all the violence that was taking place. And this happened at a time when the Biden administration is preoccupied in Ukraine, but they can't forget to be focused on moving peace forward in the Middle East. So if there's really going to be a chance for peace, the violence cycle has to end. And the constant fear of people living in danger needs to end so they can take that deep breath and look at a neighbor in a new way. And I'll close with this. I'm a grandmother now, and I don't get to see my grandchildren very often, 1, because of COVID, and 2, because they live in Japan. Mm-hmm. And I know when they put their heads on the pillow, their mom and dad wish for them peace, love, security, good health, and an education. I want the same thing for the children who are living in the occupied territory. And I want the same thing for the Israeli children. I want it for all children. So once again, children shouldn't be the lowest common denominator. They should be the high thing that we strive for as adults in protecting them. But I want every child in the United States, in Israel, in Palestine, and yes, in Japan, to live with hope and opportunity. And so I thank you so much for your work standing alongside of me in doing this. We are doing the right thing, and we're doing it at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative McCollum, for your steadfast support for Palestinian rights, for basic principles of human rights and justice, and for your principled stand to ensure that U.S. taxpayer funds are not used to violate U.S. or international law. We're grateful for your leadership and will continue to advocate in support of this effort. As you know, yesterday, 25 leaders of Christian communions and agencies issued a letter in support of H.R. 2590, representing a broad cross-section of U.S. churches and communities. In welcoming Representative McCollum's initiative, as these churches and agencies have for previous similar legislation, these Christian leaders expressed their deep concern for the Holy Land, and that they believe Congress must play a proactive role in helping to ensure justice and peace in Israel and Palestine. Citing reliable sources and reports, the letter noted that since the year 2000, an estimated 13,000 Palestinian children between the ages of 12 and 17 have been detained, prosecuted, and incarcerated by the Israeli military in the occupied West Bank. The letter points out that the COVID pandemic has only exacerbated the threats to their livelihoods that Palestinians face, including continued Israeli demolition of Palestinian homes and structures and the displacement of Palestinian families. The letter concludes by saying, "Our faith commitments call us to advocate for the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable. We are committed to speaking out until the conditions on the ground contribute to the flourishing of all Palestinians and Israeli lives. Congress has a responsibility to ensure that U.S. policy and foreign assistance reflects values that prioritize concern for the rights of the most marginalized and conform with US law. It is incumbent upon Congress to ensure no US taxpayer funds are used by any foreign government, including Israel, in a manner that violates the dignity and well-being of any group. And those 25 Christian leaders call in that letter on members of the House of Representatives to support H.R. 2590 and urge the introduction of companion legislation in the Senate. Now, we are pleased to be able to hear from a few Christian leaders and why they support this effort. I want to first turn to the Reverend Alex Awad. Alex?
Thank you, Churches for Middle East Peace, for allowing me this opportunity to share with the distinguished Congresswoman Betty McCollum. I'm a member of PCAP, and I mentioned this. PCAP is Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. I mentioned this because when I gather with my Palestinian colleagues, and whenever your name comes out, you are really our hero. So thank you so much for everything that you are doing. I'm a Palestinian. I was born in Jerusalem in 1946, 2 years before the first Arab-Israeli war. My family was caught in a crossfire between the Jordanian army and the Israeli Haganah militias. My father, who was a civilian, not a fighter, was shot and killed during the war, leaving my mother with 7 children. The youngest was 6 months old. Soon my mother, my 6 siblings, and I became refugees. We lost everything we had, and we were pushed out from West Jerusalem into East Jerusalem. Regrettably, after 74 years, Palestinian families in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip continue to be attacked. Their homes are demolished. Their children and youth are incarcerated while their land is confiscated. Therefore, your advocacy on our behalf is vital. On behalf of all Palestinians, I want to express sincere appreciation for your willingness to be a voice for the voiceless Palestinians. For years, we have been calling on the United States government to seek justice and to act as fair broker between Palestinians and Israelis. However, our cries for justice were ignored by US policymakers, and especially by members of Congress. And then, like a fresh breeze, we began hearing about you and your introduction of H.R. 2590. Recently, you courageously stood in solidarity with the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations and NGOs that were censored by Israel. I want you to know that the Palestinian people deeply appreciate your courage and your willingness to go against the tide. I want to kindly urge you to do your best to have the Biden administration call on Israel to end the IDF, Israeli soldiers, assaults on Palestinian homes after midnight. This Israeli tactic traumatizes whole families, but especially the children. Children, women, the sick, and the elderly in the Gaza Strip have nowhere to flee during the frequent Israeli bombardments of the Gaza Strip. You know, when I watched what's happening in the Ukraine, I know it's very, very horrible in a much larger scale, but yet many of the children and women and families in Ukraine are able to flee to Poland or other countries. However, when Palestinians are bombed in Gaza, there's no place for them to flee. And quite often when they flee to a building, that building collapses and many of them get killed under the rubble of their own homes. Children, women, the sick, and the elderly in Gaza Strip have nowhere to flee during the frequent Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Israel must end its attack on the civilian population of Gaza and end the blockade. And I appreciate everything that you can do to help fulfill that. Finally, America and American politicians must stop treating Palestinians as if we are enemies. Palestinians love this country. We love the United States. We love the American people. The Biden administration can reach out to Palestinians by reopening the offices of the Palestinian ambassador to the US in Washington, DC, and resume dialogue with the Palestinian leadership. For everything you are doing, I and we as Palestinian people want to deeply, deeply give you all the appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to turn now to the Reverend Riz Prakasim.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and being here today, especially to Congresswoman McCollum. We share deep gratitude for your advocacy and for your time and space. I bring you greetings from New Life Presbyterian Church located in Roseville, Minnesota, and on behalf of our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA. Roseville is located in the 4th District that you represent and serve. It has been my honor to serve our faith community, which is an earth care congregation, meaning we ask those critical questions of, are we living correctly? Are we living in a way that touches the earth lightly and gives life to all of creation? We know that you are a supporter of rights for all of creation, including the earth, human rights, and in particular now, Palestinian rights, especially of the least, our children. We're also a Matthew 25 congregation, which means that we ask the critical questions of how are we living in relationship to one another in regards to eradicating systemic racism, poverty, and congregational vitality. It has been my joy and pleasure and honor to serve this congregation for almost 9 years now as a resident of the great Commonwealth of Minnesota, which I have been a part of for over 30 years. Our nation, the United States, has provided refuge for me and my family. When as a child, we fled my native South Africa, which was devouring us under a rapacious system called apartheid, with the simple fact of being whom God created us to be. So when I read the accounts, the treatment of Palestinians, I am inevitably reminded of the apartheid regime, which denied life for us at every turn. And in particular, those young people, the students who refused to be silent, who spoke out against what is happening and wanted the world to know they were crushed under this brutal regime. I believe that the reason my parents chose to come to the United States is because our nation imposed sanctions on the South African government, including divesting its resources from the ways the apartheid regime utilized support from the United States to oppress its BIPOC population. We came to this nation because it was a beacon of light, standing up and speaking out on the world stage for what is right and for what is just. And so we are asking our nation's leaders to once again stand up and speak out on behalf of the oppressed and advocate for justice. HR 2590 has the backing of over 170 civil society organizations, including many faith-based groups. Our understanding of faith calls us to advocate for the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable. In our churches and communities across the country, our members, your constituents, are increasingly concerned about the deteriorating conditions for Palestinians who continue to live under a brutal military occupation. We are called to be a voice for the voiceless, to make level the hills and fill in the valleys for the least. We have been given a biblical commandment to love one another as we love ourselves. And this means that we are responsible for the well-being of one another. And also we are held in account to the actions of one another. Our nation's leaders are not only accountable to those who elected them, but to the entire nation and to the world who looks to our country as a beacon of hope. Congress has a responsibility to ensure that U.S. policy and foreign assistance reflects values that prioritize concern for the rights of the most marginalized and conform with U.S. law. And if we truly do value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for our citizens, we must work to ensure those tenets are extended to our neighbors the world over. Therefore, we call on our elected leaders to support HR 2590 and end the state-sponsored suffering of the least. And when I remember the least, I think about this quote from Gandhi: "The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members." Our church, the Presbyterian Church, has a motto. We say, "Reformed, always reforming." That means we take a look at how we are leading our collective lives and recalibrate and adjust ourselves to live in a way that gives life for all. We live in a way that upholds all of our values and tenets that we lift high. And so I will end today with the words of Paul Wellstone: "We all do better when we all do better." Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Prakasim. Bishop Hassanally, would you share some remarks, please?
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Regina Hassanally. I serve as Bishop of the Southeastern Minnesota Synod in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The ELCA is a Protestant denomination of roughly 3 million people in the United States, and we are also a church with partners throughout the world, including the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. I am also a mother to 4 young sons, ages 4 through 12, and it's with both of these pieces of my identity at the fore of my mind I speak with you this afternoon. One of the tenets of the Christian faith is a theological concept called Imago Dei. It means that we believe that all people are made in the image of God. All people, including children, bear the image of God in the world. And this understanding of one another's humanity, rooted in divine reflection, shapes much of what we do and how we interact in the world as Christian disciples. It is this understanding of Imago Dei that compels me to speak on behalf of HR 2590 today, a bill that seeks accountability for the ways children made in God's own image are treated. It isn't only that we understand as Christians that all people bear God's image. We also understand throughout the witness of our sacred scriptures that God cares for the poor, the marginalized, and the downtrodden. And wherever those in power use their power to evoke fear, we must speak out. For Christians, it is an act of discipleship. It is with these teachings as a framework that in 2019, our church gathered in a National Assembly, which is the highest legislative body for our denomination, voted to support a prior iteration of this bill. And it is that action from 2019 that informs our continued support today. We are one of the over 170 plus organizations that support HR 2590, and our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, is a signatory on the faith letter in support of this bill. Our faith compels us to advocate in this way. I understand that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complex, but complexity ought not lead to inaction, nor does it excuse it. Even in the midst of a long and complicated history, I ask you to join me and other leaders of the Christian faith in doing all we can to ensure that the image of God, evident in each of us and all of us, guides our understanding of how we treat our neighbor, all of our neighbors, no matter the place they call home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop. Susan, could we turn to you?
Yes, thank you, Peter. My name is Susan Gunn. I'm the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, the Washington office for Maryknoll missioners. We are Catholic missionaries, Catholic sisters, priests, brothers, lay missionaries living and working with vulnerable people on the margins in 25 countries around the world. And that's very often children. A Maryknoll sister in Jerusalem sent me a WhatsApp message a few weeks ago about her daily commute through a checkpoint. And she said it's hard to see how some Palestinians are treated at the checkpoint. And she said, I feel angry and helpless. Angry and helpless, that seems to be the universal feeling of so many Palestinians subjected to Israeli occupation. And now imagine you are a child living under this occupation. I can't think of anyone more vulnerable than a child, taken from his or her parents and locked away in a prison cell. And yet each year, the Israeli military detains and prosecutes more than 500 children. And that's why we and more than 170 civil society organizations, and including many of the faith-based groups here, support HR 2590. This bill seeks to ensure that no US taxpayer funds are used by the Israeli government for military detention of Palestinian children, for the demolition of Palestinian homes and property, and for the further annexation of Palestinian land in violation of international law. Despite the continued realities of the COVID pandemic, the displacement of Palestinians has continued at an accelerated rate. Palestinian children continue to be taken into Israeli military custody, and Palestinian land continues to be annexed, even if it has been formally off the table under the Bennett government. And in the first 13 months of President Biden's term, documentation compiled by the UN notes that home demolitions throughout the West Bank have resulted in the displacement of over 1,300 Palestinians, and the majority of them are children. Children have rights. Children's rights are not special rights or different rights. They are fundamental human rights. A child is a human being entitled to be treated as such and celebrated. More than 60 years ago, the UN adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been adopted by all member nations at the UN except the United States. That's 196 countries. These global initiatives recognize the importance of protecting children and promoting their welfare. I want to acknowledge that it's awkward when the United States tries to promote child rights in other countries. Those countries often remind us that they have joined the UN treaty and we have not. It's also important to note that the United Nations has documented in its reports that the United States has the highest child incarceration rate in the world. Children are suffering in US immigration detention centers, and they are suffering in Israeli jails. We have to take some sort of action. Our letter to Congress about HR 2590 says our faith calls us to advocate for the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable. In our churches and communities around this country, our members are increasingly concerned about the deteriorating conditions for Palestinians who live under this brutal military occupation. So we are committed to speaking out. And we want all life to flourish: Palestinian, Israeli, immigrant, migrant, refugee, all lives. Palestinian children in Israel, and especially those who happen to live very near Israeli settlements, have been subjected to persistent and disturbing practices by Israeli forces with regard to arresting, incarcerating, and trying Palestinian children in Israeli military courts. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz has published horrific testimonies by Palestinian boys, some as young as 12 years old, who have been arrested and jailed, And I just want to read a part so we know their stories. According to the boys' testimonies in the newspaper, Israeli Defense Forces soldiers typically burst into the house in the middle of the night, seize the wanted youth, whisk him away. Very few girls are detained, leaving the family with a document stating where he has been taken and on what charge. Parts of that document might be in Hebrew and the parents can't read it. In most cases, the handcuffed and blindfolded youth will be moved from place to place before actually being interrogated. Sometimes he is left outside in the open for a time. In addition to the discomfort and the bewilderment, the frequent moving around creates another problem. In the meantime, many acts of violence in which soldiers beat the children take place and go undocumented. Once at the army base or police station, the minor is placed still handcuffed and blindfolded on a chair or on a floor for a few hours, generally without being given anything to eat. It's an endless trip to hell, is how an attorney who represents Palestinian youth described it. Memory of the incident, she added, is still there even years after the boy's release. It implants in the children an ongoing feeling of a lack of security, which will stay with them for their whole lives. This is followed by interrogations where threats of violence are common, and months of detention, waiting for trial, and later, if they are sentenced, are spent in the youth wing of the facilities for security prisoners. They don't speak with their families for months, and they're allowed one visit a month through a glass. We need to remove US tax dollars from paying for human rights violations against Palestinian children in Israeli military detention. We need HR 2590. That Maryknoll sister in Jerusalem said people feel angry and helpless, but we are not helpless here. We need HR 2590 as our first step. So I thank you for listening, and I thank you for your support for this bill. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to all of our speakers today. I think what is clear is that the church community has a lot of experience and experience from engagement with people in Israel, Palestine directly through our mission connections and through our acquaintances and visits, as well as our engagement on issues in peace and justice throughout the world, including here in the United States. Also, the faith community is compelled to act based on an understanding of Scripture and based on an understanding of how our faith requires us to engage the world. So we're grateful for the work that Representative McCollum is doing and urge other members of Congress to take up that task as well in the same way. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and there are a couple in the box. The first one is, it seems clear that this bill is to protect children from a military system that is so brutal. The questioner asks if Representative McCollum can share with us some of the objections she's heard from lawmakers who are disinclined to support the bill. And then to follow up on that, if some of our faith leaders can share some of the arguments that seem to be more persuasive in talking with members of the faith communities about this issue. So I wonder if Libby is on and is in a position to respond to the question that's posed to Representative McCollum.
And I apologize. I know that the Congresswoman had another meeting she had to hop into. So sure. I know that she wanted a rundown of all this, so I'll make sure to fill her in on the questions as well. So thank you so much for everything that everyone said. It really means a lot to our office to get this support, and we wouldn't have the members that we do on the bill without it. So just again, thank you. I admittedly don't want to speak for my boss, because I imagine a lot of those conversations that she has are probably a member to member conversation, but I would imagine, and kind of more generally speaking, I've heard that, and I think she alluded to this earlier, that, a lot of people are probably privately ready to get on the bill, but are scared kind of from external pressure that they might get from, just outside interests. So just haven't kind of been forced one way or the other to kind of take the kind of courageous leap to actually co-sponsor the bill, despite the fact that they might kind of personally understand and agree and appreciate kind of everything that the bill tries to do, which is frustrating. But again, I know that kind of the pressure in a good way from groups like yours and the grassroots activists does really move members in the right direction and ensures, it is, we are dealing with kind of politics up here, but, that if they do get, put their name on a bill like that, that they know, their constituents in their districts have their back and will kind of support them and speak out that way too. So, I think my boss would have done a better job answering that question, but I hope that was helpful. And I'm happy to, again, share this with her and also be able to kind of answer questions later if that would be helpful. But thank you again.
Thank you very much, Libby. Certainly you can be assured of the support of our faith communities, and hope that you'll be willing to share the faith leaders letter with colleagues so that they can see the great support that exists among the Christian community, at least, and certainly the others as well. Up to 180 organizations are supporting this piece of legislation when they speak about some of the pushback that they're experiencing. I wonder if
we make everything public. Don't you worry. We make sure they see all the letters. No, but thank you. It really, that is great. So we'll make sure to share that. Thank you.
And we also commit to continue to work and advocate with the variety of offices to make sure that they know of our support. I'm wondering if some of the faith leaders who are here might share some of the arguments that have been persuasive in talking with members within our own faith communities. And I might just share that it's especially important and helpful as I've engaged with members in our churches to humanize the realities that are experiencing and help them to understand the impact on human beings, to get away from intellectual arguments and to get to the human level. And I think we've heard some of that today from our speakers. So I'm wondering if some of our speakers might be willing to share some of the conversations they've had. This is Mitchell. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, Doug Mitchell. I'm a pastor emeritus at Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis, and we've had a relational partnership for 12 years now with Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem and with ELCA, University of Arts and Culture. And our members really respond to the call to protect children. As we've had more and more people travel, we've had probably 30 trips to Israel and Palestine, and these going through checkpoints, experiencing what Palestinians live through day in and day out is the most convincing argument there is. So getting people on the ground, and travel has been begun again after the pandemic. It's slow, but getting people on the ground to speak one-on-one with Palestinians and Israelis and experience what life is like is the best teacher and is much more persuasive than intellectual arguments.
Thank you, Reverend Mitchell. And indeed, in our churches, we do encourage our members to make that bucket trip visit to Israel, Palestine, and the Holy Land, to visit the places that they read about in the scriptures. But when they're there, to meet with people and to engage with the Christian community, especially, and to experience the reality that the Christian communities are living there today. I wonder if others would like to weigh in on that, on the question of some of the conversations that you've had within your communities.
I just want to second what was shared, that once you've seen it, you can't forget it, and you can't deny the truth of the occupation and the systematic damage that is done across generations. So where can we begin? And of course, we begin with the children, and our faith orients us towards family. So we begin the conversation there, but to witness it is unforgettable. And that's why it's so important also for members of Congress, if they do travel to the Holy Land, that they have a comprehensive visit and have a full relationship with all peoples there.
Thank you, Susan. Alex, I think you're trying to speak. You're on mute.
Yeah, one thing that frustrates me is that here I live in Eugene, Oregon, and our senators are, especially Senator Wyden, he's progressive on every issue except on Palestine and the Palestinian situation. So one day he came to Eugene, and I was one of the people who was invited for a dialogue that he had with faith leaders. So I was there, and I decided, I'm going to give him a letter in his hand. And of course, the letter describes the situation in the West Bank and urging him to do something about it. And so, I shook his hand. Somebody took a picture of me handing him the letter. That was really great. And he said he will read the letter and write back to me. Well, I never heard from him. And that is the sad thing, the silence of some of members of Congress when it comes to Palestinian rights, total silence. They don't want to engage in this issue. But, I tell my colleagues, don't give up. We have to keep knocking at the door until their conscience gets to bother them, and then hopefully one day they open their hearts to our cries.
Thank you, Alex. Well, we're coming to the close of our time, and we hope that this session today has been enlightening and helpful and also motivating for you. On behalf of Churches for Middle East Peace and the Faith Forum for Middle East Policy, we want to thank you all very much for your participation today, especially Representative McCollum for her tireless work on this issue, and to each of our speakers this afternoon for your engagement on the issue, as well as all of your commitments to work for consistent U.S. policy based on the principles of peace, justice, human rights, conditionality, and accountability. There are a number of links that have been posted in the chat today, and I hope you'll grab those. We will follow up with an email to participants and appreciate your attendance today. In closing, I'd like to turn to the Reverend Doug Mitchell, Pastor Emeritus of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis, who will offer our closing benediction.
Thank you, Peter. Let us pray together. Out of a community of diverse heritage and belief, we come together to share our hope and to create good in the world. The prophets of all traditions and times have taught us that we are called to justice, mercy, generosity, and mutual care, and that to be great is to serve. We know that there can be no enduring happiness for humanity so long as suffering and oppression go unrelieved. May the power of our faiths sustain us in this work, that we may be the hands of creativity and justice, that we may give ourselves to uplift the lives of our siblings and together build a better world. In the midst of a time of massive dislocation of people from their homes and their homelands, we pray especially for the peoples of Palestine and Israel, that they may find a just resolve of their differences that will allow them to live in peace. We pray for the people of Ukraine, of Cameroon, of Somalia, of Ethiopia, of South Sudan, and of so many other places where violence has caused massive disruptions of life and people. In the midst of all this chaos, we pray with the Mother of Exiles. The days are coming, says our God, when I will cleanse you of all that holds you in fear and terror, of all that blinds you to the truth. On that day, you will cry with those who mourn. You will laugh with those rejoicing. The days are coming soon and are already here, when I will give you a new heart and you will know me. On that day, the grain you have stored will feed the hungry. The wealth you have saved will protect the poor, and all children will find safe haven. On that day, all people will come into the land that God has shown them, a land of peace where justice reigns, and all God's children will find safe heaven. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Mitchell, and best wishes and blessings to all of you who have celebrated Passover and Easter and who are continuing to celebrate Ramadan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.